Okay, so I guess it's best I make this recording while it's fresh in my head. Yeah, identity politics and liberal politics in South Africa, which is yeah, I mean, there's a lot to complain about in South Africa. You know, we are fast becoming a watered down. I mean, the Constitution has already been fundamentally betrayed. The Constitution no longer stands as a liberal enshrinement of liberal values, or if it does still stand, it has been in practice, it's been demolished. So you know the words are still there, but they have been misinterpreted and reinterpreted according to uh, a kind of a pro-black ideological racism, really. I mean, we don't have a public protector anymore. We have a protector of pro-black racist ideology, you know, and we have obviously toxic elements in the judiciary and also in academia who echo this legal positivism and this ethos of having, you know, these experts in racism that have racialized every moral question under the sun. We don't have secular ethics anymore. We've got this weird religion of racist reinterpreting of every moral consideration and every issue is seen through racialism, is seen through what has now been called anti-racism. We have to recognize that anti-racism is a far cry, is the antithesis of non-racialism. So the Constitution, which has a non-racialistic foundation, is now being reinterpreted according to this uh, uh, I guess you could call it pro-black anti-racism or just anti-racism, in which, you know, it has so many strange presumptions built into it. You know, it really begs its own question on you know that all of its conclusions are presumed as its premise. You know, it doesn't make any substantive claim. It's just a table thumped. It just asserts everything in its narrative, and that's exactly how it functions as a narrative, just as the same as the Nazi philosophy needed its mythology of blood and soil and things like that. It just uses the historical version of its. When the Nazis had genetic superiority, these people have a kind of inherited moral superiority that is bestowed and that belongs to the identity. Now, this identity um, moral consideration in which all moral rights and all good things belong to identities. They don't belong to individuals. They belong first and foremost to the category of the identity, to the faction. And then you obviously need to have policy that then finds the correct sort of that finds tokens to hold the banner of the rehabilitated identity, and this project of rehabilitating the identity of feeding the dignity of the identity via kind of via supplementing its dignity that has been robbed of it from this historical original sin of whatever, of in the South African context it would be apartheid, that it needs to get the supplementary dignity that comes from a systemic complaint. So you have a complaint against the system, and because that complaint is true, then that is the missing dignity that is given to the individual via the identity. So the identity must have this claim against the system. Now, the problem with this is that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's also, you know, it is fundamentally morally corrupt. It's built on a generalization. And so this generalization is the moral corruption which has created the corruption that we see in politics and in government. Because, um, you know, the anyone that has a connection to this identity can use the poor as a human shield. You know, so the corrupt plutocrats and the kleptocrats of the black elite can just always use the identity in this way because they share in the identity. So, because the identity has the disadvantage, the identity has the claim for dignity, not the individual. So the individual just kind of gets reframed into this one size fits all narrative that is centered around the identity. So you can't even identify real challenges that people have on the ground. You can't fix real problems because the problem is the problem of the identity. It's not the problem of the individual. And so policy fundamentally has to treat people like a statistic. It has to treat people like a collective because it's only sensitive to that collectivized complaint against the system, which is owned by the identity. So already when you're in that moral reductive space, so everything becomes reductive on the level of identity. This is why it's so important that when they enter the room or why they start talking to people, the first thing that they have to do is make they have to rob you of your dignity as an individual. They have to insult you on the level of your identity, and that they have to brand you with that. And that mark, I think, archetypally, is quite connected to the mark of the beast, because the identity is exactly that thing that is conditioned by the environment, as a beast is conditioned. I mean, another way of the Nietzschean philosophy would basically describe this as a slave morality. That, well, if you need a collective complaint in order to derive your dignity, if your dignity is delineated by that kind of framework, and then that collective narrative has to have you embroiled and entrenched in some kind of broad conflagration, that you have to sort of, it's like in the same way that Nazi society had this never-ending civil war that you had to ideologically, there was this great polemic against the Jewish conspiracy constantly, and that your failure to assent to the ideological rightness of the vision of the 1,000-year Reich, or whatever it was a corruption of your natural, organic, collective narrative ethos by whatever. And now we have the modern conspiracy is that it's white, the conspiracy of systemic oppression, which is exerted from this from the white identity. Okay, so the canon of the systemic complaint, from which the dignity is supplied to the identity faction. This is problematic on multiple levels, because with that kind of canon in place, you're unable to make more incisive observations, because the leveraging of the systemic polemic over any possible interpretation of reality in this one-size-fits-all reductive filter becomes an impediment to identifying and actually solving any real problem, because unless the problem is amenable to being framed in that way, it basically goes undetected. And so there's a very kind of strange speciousness in the problem solving, that certain kinds of problems are central, and because essentially they're the problems that belong to the identity, and other kinds of problems are just kind of, they go by the wayside, because those are problems that pertain to individuals, and they are distracting from the polemic. And so, with this kind of strange dichotomy, which is, ad hoc and sort of, it's strange. Why would everything around politics and morality be centered around this kind of strange dichotomy? And I mean, this also has a toxic effect, is that because you have to always make it do more than what it currently does. The polemic has to kind of spread like a mind virus. You have to end up racializing every moral consideration and every moral question. until you've got an explanation to excuse for any aspect of someone's lack of dignity according to this kind of one-size-fits-all polemic that gives a full accounting of the dignity. And so when you have to redefine dignity in terms of this kinds of systemic polemic, you have to create a mythology around history. You have to kind of embellish history and to make it more than what it is, to make it larger than life itself, because life itself has to be echoed, an echo of that polemic, of that narrative, of that history. So everything is always this echo of something that has already happened. So nothing is causative in the present. There's no accountability. There's no political accountability for the present to inhabit. It's all been inherited. It's all already happened in some sense. And this is also how it takes on its kind of pseudo-religious, kind of framework. To the extent that even racism in the present has become racialized, and we no longer have we no longer have a public protector. We have a protector of pro-black ideological, I just see it as repurposed Nazi philosophy, as the law itself has been corrupted, but the law itself has been corrupted for a long time, and now its ideological consciousness has seeped through and infused itself with everything. The Promotion of Equality Act, which has dismantled very slowly, but has
Mm.
systematically sort of taken root and has completely corrupted the new South Africa. So much so that it never really had that many years even. When was the Promotion of Equality Act? I think it was around 2008. Maybe it was 2004, but we had probably about 10 years before we had that kind of really destroying any kind of liberal, organic. Anyway, let me just. I guess I'm just going to read some of these paragraphs that I wrote in an email. So, I mean, yeah, I basically tried to describe that we are trapped in an anti-liberal spiral of self-fulfilling prophecy of slave morality. The Promotion of Equality Act is a racist is racist and destructive, and does not do the work of affirmative action as it is described by the Constitution, detailing how we need targeted affirmative action in providing a basis of skills and experience that is supplemented through government programs that are not never-ending dependence creating artificial forms of unsustainable transformation. What transformation should mean is that would generally have to be constructed in conjunction with businesses, perhaps in projects that are consensually devised because they are, actually visionary and actually coordinate and plan something that achieves a lasting gain and transformation, instead of a current model of a kind of race to the bottom, demolishing common standards and values, as it kind of creates a form of affirmative action which never cleans up after itself. That it never sort of comes back to removing its initial impetus. Affirmative action should happen, and then it should stop happening relative to an individual, because it's actually achieved something. It's actually done something tangible. If it can't do something tangible, then that isn't affirmative action. That's something else. That's a kind of racialist welfare program that never ends. And obviously, if you have, which is also a kind of anti-liberal way of because essentially if you're giving people welfare and the welfare never ends, then you've got an unintelligent policy. You've got a policy that isn't trying to actually help people. You're trying to make them dependent. This is not something that can be administered to a population ad infinitum. It's not sustainable by definition. It's and sadly, I mean, this is I'll come to it, but essentially, this is all from the poisonous root of that so-called intellectual Du Bois, in terms of his understanding of education and oppression. But anyway, I'll come to that. Yeah, so I mean, one of the biggest problems that we have with the current state of corrupt affirmative action is just how it destroys networking, and it destroys organic opportunity, and an organic basis of growth, and accessing a functioning sort of economy. 'Cause, I mean, because when you have small businesses that have to do a kind of racial accounting and get into that kind of identity politics on a micro scale, um, the economy is obviously impeded in terms of doing anything, but also it's worse than that because of the premium on black labor, on professional black labor. There's really a perverse incentive, because if you under the current sort of system of affirmative action, if you force people to have a kind of racial accounting of how they are conducting their business, then as soon as you start doing business with a black professional, suddenly, if you're giving them experience that they didn't have before, uh, their their market value goes up markedly, and you can't retain them. You can't continue to do business with them, essentially, because of just the natural um, dysfunction of the market, is that there's now a greater premium on their labor, so you can't retain them. You've just empowered them to be a more uh, lucrative token for some bigger business or something like that. So you have literally just like kept small business from being able to network freely. You've actually created a toxic environment of racial accounting, and this creates kind of a systemic problem, in that the small business essentially never begins to generate an organic melting pot. I mean, usually small business is one of the biggest, one of its biggest functions is to integrate and be a kind of melting pot within a society. But because we've got this overemphasized regulatory stricture around racial accounting, uh, you know, it can work on some level for big business, but it just means that essentially we never have the most important part of the economy, which is small business. Um, because it's hard enough just to have a small business that doesn't fail. Now you have to add racial accounting and racial headhunting on top of that. It's and so small business has largely been sacrificed on the altar of this pro-black racist policy. Um, and it is the poor and a failing economy that has suffered the most due to this disrupted uh, space in the economy, uh, that has been toxically, dismantled, uh, and destroyed what would otherwise have been an organic melting pot of also a vibrant liberal culture of coordination and organic integration. Um, so, I mean, you can also see like how this disgusting identity politics consciousness targets the young, and targets education quite badly. And this, I think, is generally because of what Du Bois had to say about education, and about that weird kind of utopian consciousness that he thought would be essentially the model in which you could fix everything through. That essentially, if you can empower people, in inverted commas, to be sensitive to oppression that is tethered to this kind of hideous and immoral fantasy that's used to generate complaints about not having one's identity be good enough to facilitate a conducive sort of infantilism that's just meant to be provided by your society. So there's this baseline that everything should be handed to you, and your curiosity and your, just kind of whatever it is, just your sort of your half baked desire should just be endorsed by your society. And if you feel crestfallen or deprived in any facet, essentially, you can just kind of always cherry pick somebody else's experience of someone else's identity within your society, and say, well, why don't I get the same as that? I'm not equal to that, or something like that. So there's something wrong with my identity. My identity has not been guarded and protected from the systemic oppression. And so you kind of have this strange mediation of reality and life, in that you are not engaging with life as an individual. You're engaging with life on behalf of your sort of the powers of your identity, um, and the lack of honor that your identity is accorded from the political establishment. And so also your identity is a political conduit, instead of a kind of cultural and liberal medium of self-reflected negotiation between members who are given the dignity of free association. Essentially, free association is completely demolished within the Du Bois. I mean, it's not overtly, but it is covertly demolished, because I mean, essentially, he would say, no, no, we're for all the good things, but they have inherent contradictions built into them, and those contradictions are never resolved, because he's not an intellectual. He's just a stupid fascist, and this is just stupid fascist propaganda that he has managed to infect a whole generation with. Um, and so this kind of identitarian propaganda, which sadly even liberal outlets have been infected with, this kind of, where they will focus that women and girls. I've seen this as well, and this kind of propaganda is doomed to fail, because you cannot give people special consciousness based on their identity. It doesn't function. Uh, the best you can hope to give them is access to individualism, and individuals can have, as individuals, bad characteristics and good characteristics, and those good and bad characteristics will generate their fates far more than their identity ever will. But instead of telling people that they are individuals, it instead tells people that no, they are women and girls, and that if everyone must give them dignity based on that identity status. And when liberal outlets are pushing this really covert, insidious, kind of identitarian propaganda, they are just really fueling the fires, which they won't light the match of those fires in some sense, because they can't even. They are providing the prerequisite of the kind of toxic consciousness that allows for the EFF style politics to because they will actually provide a scapegoat. They will actually provide a target, an outlet. They will say, well, it's the patriarchy is fundamentally white, or something like that. That they will actually provide an outlet for venting radical frustration, as it were. They will provide the target. Whereas the idea that essentially, if everyone just has the same consciousness, if everyone just says, yes, women need more because they have been oppressed historically as women, if we can just all believe that collectively, it doesn't really help, because there'll still be some girls and some women who won't achieve. And then they'll say, well, then what was it about my identity that made me not be able to achieve? It must be that the system is still entrenched in some kind of oppression. So, this is the problem, is that it's not able to actually deal with any kind of reality, because the polemic reduction is just always available to you. And so it will always create a complaint that needs actually to be processed in some disgusting, usually overtly fascistic expression. And I mean, this is why I'm very upset when I see these people trying to sort of create a special status around women and girls. It's a doomed project. Or in that it's not non-sexist. It's anti-constitutional for one thing. Um, it is fundamentally sexist, and it's fundamentally also to provoke a crude natural reaction, which is that not all women deserve respect. I mean, no one should be accorded respect just based on their identity. I mean, it's fucking retarded. It's utterly antithetical to real morality and real ethics. This is moral corruption right from the go. And so I mean, it's the same kind of paradox. When you try to racialize racism, and then you end up making somehow everything becomes racist except for the thing that is racializing racism, and so everyone must agree that with the process of racializing racism, so that everyone has the same polemic, the same narrative. Um, and what does this really do? All these paradoxes, that somehow identities themselves invoke or demand or are entitled to a certain kind of respect. Uh, all these paradoxes deliver is essentially a solvent, or I'm trying to make a metaphor, something that dissolves um, and destabilizes the notion of responsibility and accountability of anything and everything, because then there's an identitarian explanation, there's an identitarian moral formula which can be read into whatever is happening. And so you don't have to actually look at what people are doing, because you can just say, oh, what you are doing is an echo of the past, is an echo of somebody else's actions. You don't have any responsibility. That's all it does, is it just helps you to assuage. I mean, essentially it does provide a supplementary form of dignity, but that dignity is slave morality. That's exactly what it is. You're giving to people a slave morality. And that is fundamentally toxic, and it's also fundamentally addictive, in the sense that you'll always need more of it. That if you accept it at any level, you'll need to accept more of it just to conserve what you have already accepted. And it's unsustainable. And this has been played out in South African politics on many different levels. It's unsustainable on the economic level, on the level of economic growth, on the level of economic stability, on the level of government, the growth of government and the growth of government policy. And it's also happening on the moral landscape. That it started off as just this kind of sympathy, this kind of this everyone should believe in this form of sympathy, that is a kind of collectivized guilt over everyone, and that everyone should accept this narrative. And then where does it lead to? Well, it leads to overt black fascism. And that's exactly, sort of where we are with our public officials. We have a moral corruption which has metastasized into, a kind of full-blown sort of cultural totalitarianism and black racist, pro black racist political ideology, which is, and we've got it all over the place, and it is obviously a betrayal of non-racialism. And even, the public protector will say things that are basically anti-constitutional, that betray the Constitution, just as the Chief Justice has said things that betray the Constitution and betray non-racialism. It doesn't matter to them. You have to, just to keep the status quo, just to rationalize what has happened in recent years with the Constitution, or with the promotion of Equality Act, just to kind of keep that going without, because if you were to actually recognize the spiral, the doom spiral for what it is, and diagnose the actual cause of it, we would have to say, well, the cause are these journalists and these propaganda artists, are, the Eusebius McKaisers of the radio, and, well, I guess even John Matham echoes, this kind of agenda, because you can't not have a public voice and give some kind of credence to this disgusting disaster, slow motion train wreck, which has stopped being the new South Africa for a long time now. But unless we're serious about diagnosing and it's problematic as well, because many people just generally within the population are not politically minded people. They don't have the kind of ethical consideration that you need to have a real political consciousness. And so identity consciousness and identity politics is a very nice way to feel sophisticated, to feel like all the intelligent people agree with you, all the people from academia, all the historians and the sociologists, they're on your side. And it's very emotionally empowering, because of, it's so reductive that you can frame, you can imagine with your radical imagination all the things that are being displaced by the systemic oppression. It really gives a kind of moral imagination to people, which is very detached and disembodied. It's very hypothetical. It's the same hyperrealism that took over Nazi Germany. And it has its book burnings, it has its you get to share in this weird kind of subconscious, this weird collective subconscious, which is underpinned by the ideological narrative. And so the kind of the orthodoxy of that narrative just needs to be protected, and then you can sort of you get to join in this weird kind of hypothetical collective imagination. As long as there's someone that you can throw under the bus, and to excuse, let's say, the derogation and the destruction of liberal values, which is kind of the looming casualty of this project, of this overt fascistic spiral. And yeah, I mean, it's very hard to imagine who's going to put the brakes to it, or if it's possible. It seems to me that it's so decentralized. It's kind of, I mean, technically I would call it proto-fascism, because they don't yet have a Führer principle. But in some sense, the ideological narrative serves as the Führer. So they all have the same complaint of systemic oppression. I mean, basically, if you believe in systemic oppression, that is your Führer. As soon as you can vest that narrative into a political leader, or into a political faction, or a political expression, other than the identity, as soon as you have someone who you say, okay, I'm willing to let that identity defend, willing to let that individual defend the identity, then, I mean, that's the definition of Führer. Führer means savior, the savior of the system and the guardian of the identity. So that still hasn't happened yet, but culturally, I see it's already been dreamed. It's already been, there are people who have already given themselves to it, and I mean, from my psychological sort of understanding of these things and my research, I would say that Nazi Germany only occurred with about 20% of the population that was an adherent to the ideology. And I think that you only need about 20% of the population. I mean, that's why they had a coup, because You'll never get the majority, but if you get 20% of the population, you have enough of a kind of basis that the rest of the people are too demoralized to stop you, because they've been listening to the ideology, they've been listening to the argument for so long that in fact they just want someone to do something about it, even if they don't fully believe it themselves, just so that they don't have to hear it anymore. The problem is that they make it even worse. They don't solve the problem. Um, the hyperrealism went up when the Nazis took over, not down. Um, the propaganda accelerated, and in some sense, I think that the consciousness of the German people was put on a fast track to even further levels of insanity. And you can see this, within the propaganda against the conspiracy theory of systemic oppression and white male privilege. That it gets more and more delusional and detached and sort of and strangely um, esoteric and abstract. Um,